Okay, I'm going to kick off. My name's Daniel Hilson. I'm the CEO and founder of Energy and the program manager of the Charge Together Fleets program. So very excited today to have this webinar on a critical issue, which is around fast charging. And there's two kind of reasons for that. One is obviously for fleets. It's about whether that will be a key future paradigm for charging, even within cities. And the second is just through the process that these guys have gone through to install, procure, test the whole life cycle. So, just a reminder about Charge Together, it's really about building a community to accelerate the transition to electric vehicles through accelerating the adoption of electric vehicles in fleets. So the meeting rules of this meeting, number one is that if you're not speaking, please stay on mute. We essentially ask for questions throughout, but if you could just type them into the chat box and also say where you're from and your name, then Alex will ask the presenters those questions at the end. So as we go, put in as many questions as you like. Tell us who you are. We'd love to get to know who's on the call, and then we'll ask those questions at the end. Okay, so without any delay, I wanted to firstly introduce Amelia from NRMA. As most of you know, NRMA has a very ambitious plan for rolling out fast chargers. They are a mutual, so it was a social license type operation decision for them, which meant that they could really do it in a different way. And Amelia was deeply engaged in reaching out to councils and right across the program. So I'll hand it over to her now. And thank you very much, everyone, for attending.
Can everyone see my screen?
It's just coming up now.
Okay, beautiful. You can see it now?
Yep, perfect.
Ah, beautiful. Excellent. It's all working now. Hi, everyone. So yes, I'm Amelia Starr. So I work on the EV network project here at the NRMA. And I'm sorry, but I'm in the world's largest meeting room and there's only one of me. So if I'm a bit echoey, I'm sorry for that. And look, my role specifically with the project was around kind of site cultivation and working with our site partners to procure sites for our electric vehicle fast charger program. And I believe our former program director is online today, Bernard. So he was obviously also heavily involved in pulling together this program. So it was a very, and still is a very ambitious program for the NRMA. And I thought it would be just helpful to kind of go through a little bit in terms of the why about how we got into it, but also just to cover off on just what we've learnt to date in terms of that site procurement process and some of the challenges we've found elsewhere, both from, securing energy and power to our sites, and also just different types of land issues that we've kind of come across, and then right through to the customer experience, because they're all really important things to be thinking about. Obviously, EVs and EV infrastructure are very hot topics at the moment. We feel like we get obviously asked a whole lot more about this since it got on Talkback Radio. But I think it actually highlights a really critical point in this EV story, which is that really the public is largely ill-informed about electric vehicles and really has even less understanding about EV infrastructure. So I would say one of the biggest components of our program to date has actually been just educating people about what it is. I think there's a sense that the only electric vehicles in the marketplace are Teslas, and whilst there are a lot of them, I think this sense that they're not for everybody was very strong when we first started this project, and the sense that other manufacturers are coming into the marketplace has certainly made the conversation about affordability a lot easier. But I think the second thing is when you talk to someone in a community environment, so whether it's a local council partner, some of our local council partners, even private partners, and you talk about charging infrastructure, people have very different levels of understanding about the product. And I think it's actually really important because I feel that the more we can do to educate the general public about what it means and what it does and what it means for the future, the easier the conversations come around infrastructure deployment. So as I said, some of the things that we've been asked a lot about is, it pretty much covers over what you've probably heard in local media. There's a lot of conjecture about emissions and whether they're actually green. And again, you go out to some of our regional partners and they're like, well, we might have a lot of solar panels out here, but I don't see them charging your car. So we kind of cover off on all of that. Cost is another big thing. Obviously, price parity is kind of coming into more of a light, but it's still very hard to kind of sell the idea that EVs are for everybody. I think the best conversations I have are with tradies in regional towns when they say, well, I don't see an EV ute. And I say, well, actually, there is going to be some. So I kind of feel there's going to be some critical points in this journey where we're going to see the everyday consumer kind of get a better grip on it. And it is when, when you start to see tradespeople using EVs and that kind of thing, I think that's a real game changer, just as much as commercial freighting will be. Infrastructure, both at home and abroad. As I said, I think, you've heard a lot of conversation in the news about, well, where are you going to put it? And you're going to have cords all over footpaths and all sorts of stuff. So again, there's a very limited level of understanding about what charging infrastructure would be where. And I think that's also incredibly important that, there's a charging story and there's lots of different types that can be on offer. Range anxiety is a big one. And I was talking to a group of four-wheel drivers the other day and they were like, well, you don't see, any chargers out in the bush. And I said, yeah, but you don't see any petrol stations either. So I think again, there's just all these misconceptions. Towing capacity is another one that gets raised, that there's limited types of vehicles. So I kind of, as I said, whilst we're talking about infrastructure, I think we need to accept that the ecosystem that we're sitting in is full of all of these misconceptions and different ideas about what it means for the everyday person. And I feel the more we can make it palatable to everyday people and the easier we are at translating that message to everyday consumers, the easier that infrastructure story will be. As I said, we're specifically looking at fast charging infrastructure. And again, I know many of you on the line are obviously very converted to the language of EV charging infrastructure. But I would say this slide here is probably the one that is the most influential when we go to talk to site partners, because most people really don't still understand entirely what we're delivering. And again, part of that is there's not a uniform language within the charging infrastructure space. Some people call it rapid charging. So it is a bit tricky. And it's for that very reason that we named the network Nothing Fancy. We called it the Electric Vehicle Fast Charging Network because we know that we're dealing with a largely uneducated motoring population, and we wanted to be really clear about what that piece of infrastructure did. And again, so ours is 50 kilowatt DC fast chargers, around 30 minutes for 80% charge. And we know this is only for a reasonably small proportion of journeying, 5 to 10%, but it's obviously critical to long distance EV journeying. And that's really important for us when we're dealing with members, because we have, over 50% of our members live in regional areas. So as I said, there is demand for EVs, but the barriers to adoption are quite large. And this is really the key reason that the NRMA got involved in looking at a whole EV fast charging network, is that whilst we may not be able to necessarily address the cost of vehicles, we could at least deal with the issue around range anxiety. And when we surveyed our members, it was really interesting to some of the feedback was that if fast charging infrastructure was available, a large proportion were actually more likely to consider purchasing an EV. Those that already had them were more likely to journey. And as I said, I think what was most important is that the greatest proportion of people actually wanted those things located in regional towns and close to amenities. So I think we understand that the EV charging experience is different to refueling your car. And it's really important then to consider what will people do whilst they're waiting for their car to be charged. And it was, as I said, it was really interesting that the research really backed up what our program was trying to deliver, which is not necessarily delivering things on highway fast routes, so not in service stations and that kind of thing. We wanted to bring the infrastructure into towns because we know that then at least people have a safe and secure environment. They're more likely to interact and bring a little bit of commercial return to those local communities. And because our project is being delivered under a social dividend investment, it is really about reinvesting back in communities. So it aligned up quite well with what we were trying to achieve with our project. As I said, a big reason we're doing this network is to help change the perceptions around EV ownership. We know that range anxiety is real, and funnily enough, having recently driven an EV on my first long distance trip, I didn't quite expect to feel it as much as I did, but 19% quickly dropped to 11% in a very short amount of time. And so as I said, I think it's still very real, and I think it's going to be real for a long time until people get comfortable with the idea of how to actually use an EV and what it means to actually be driving one. And also until there's more infrastructure on the ground. And we certainly know that the more infrastructure we put down, the more comfortable people are becoming with the idea of owning an EV. So our network is going to cover 95% of member road trips. So it's our focusing is on major highways in New South Wales and the ACT. We are doing universally accessible EV fast chargers. And again, that's probably our key point of difference. And that's quite important for us as a brand, because we want to make sure that the full spectrum of EVs that are in the marketplace, from the more cost effective through to the higher end models, can be charged. And as I said, we're installing 50 kilowatt fast chargers. We obviously do have a key focus on connecting tourism routes. And that is because we want people journeying and we want them getting out there once they do have an EV. Very important for us. The 10 million only stretches so far, and ours is very much a partnership model with local communities and industry. Our key relationships are with local councils. And as I said, it's free for NRMA members to use our chargers, and it will be available at a reasonable cost to non-members. At the moment, the network is free to everyone. So I thought it was just important to kind of give you a bit of an overview of what we think about when we're looking for sites. And again, this has actually come up in a number of conversations, and we get asked this question a lot: what is critical? So obviously power is pretty important, and what infrastructure is located nearby, where it's coming from, whether it's private or public power, and also just in terms of upgrade costs. So we have spent quite a lot of time going out there and doing site surveys, making sure that we've got the power situation right, and doing the right electrical design work. We are finding a lot of sites do require level 3 works. And that's just because in regional towns, some of the infrastructure is not as great. And again, so that is quite challenging for us. The other thing that we look for is obviously amenity access. So we want to make sure that if you're pulling up to use one of our fast chargers, you can use bathrooms, you can go and get something to eat. Ideally, there's something for the kids to do if you're on a long trip, but also that there's night security. So our infrastructure is available 24 hours. So we want to make sure they're in locations that people would feel safe to charge and be in their car at night. Obviously, we're looking for reasonably high visibility sites. So we are looking for sites that are kind of on the entrance to towns or within the town main street areas. And again, just appreciating that this program is pretty much 98% regional. So it's really very much focused on kind of creating a regional community. Obviously, the other thing we're looking at is where we put them. We found that a lot of parking areas are quite contested, and we know that one of the biggest bugbears of EV drivers is being iced. And so we've been quite conscious at making sure that we don't kind of pick the most blue ribbon location at times. It might be the car park just down a little bit further, or maybe behind a council building, for the reason that we don't want to create a situation where the infrastructure is hard to access. And as I said, we really are looking for sites too that can kind of give an economic return to the community. So the idea of putting as the sites close to where shops and amenities are is quite important for us. And now I go through just a few things in terms of what we're learning from the process. And I said, I've kind of kept it fairly high level, but I'm very happy to take questions, noting that there's other presenters today. But I suppose land type, we've learned a huge amount about different types of land. And as I said, we deal primarily with local councils, but even with our private site partners, yeah, our experience is that operational land is easiest to work with, even though Crown and community land sites have been built on for our network, but they seem to be, obviously there's more complexities there around engaging with the community and making sure people have notification about the intended use of the site. I think it's obviously really helpful if there's council people on the line to really actually do a bit of an audit and look at what are the sites that you'd be happy for infrastructure to go down, because I suspect one of the questions that councils often ask us is, you know, if we look at building something with you, how do we stop others coming in, or where would we build other sites, you know, with other providers that come in? And it's like, well, I can understand there is this sense that we might start the ball rolling for them, and then they'll get inundated with providers coming in wanting to find sites. So I think there is a bit at the moment we're in a space where there's not much else. But I think for council partners and even private site partners to identify where in your community you would like infrastructure, I think is quite important. And certainly I think too, with the fleet conversion, I feel that local councils are going to be really incredibly important at actually socialising electric vehicles in their communities. So the infrastructure piece can actually be a really important part of that story. And as I said, I think it's really important to consider the different levels of charging that you might want in a community. As I said, we found obviously level 2 charging is not as complex, but as I said, for that level 3 story, excuse me, for any of that DC fast charging story, you do actually need to have the right type of land for the use as well. The second one I was going to go into is approvals processes. So I would say that when we started this journey, there was no state environmental plan amendment that actually talked about EV charging infrastructure. And I would say that we spent the majority of our time actually working with site partners, primarily local councils, to actually develop policies that would help support EV infrastructure to go in place. I would say that when the amendment came through, it actually gave not a green light for councils to at least work with us, but it made them a lot more comfortable that they could actually have discussions about where the fast charging infrastructure should go in their community. And obviously too, it opened up a lot more site options for us in terms of where the infrastructure could go down. Look, I think hands down, and this is probably something that a lot of people on the line would know, power connections are pretty critical to this story. And undeniably, it's actually been one of the hardest spaces for us. As I said, one of the key issues there is that there's not really any SLAs for determining grid capacity for sites. There's a big delay in getting power investigations back. So even though the grid authorities are actually working very hard, and I know that they're very caught up with NBN requests and various other things, you know, you're typically looking at anywhere between 4 to 8 weeks to get initial power investigations back. And so we've often said that probably some of those good local relationships with Essential Energy and other providers could help move that along. But again, it's one of those things that you have to factor in when you're building EV fast charging infrastructure, that you don't really have control over those timelines. Grid upgrades has also been an issue in terms of timing. So there's been some that we've actually been able to get Essential Energy to do where they're under a certain ampage, but it's also just looking at where we actually do have to do any kind of grid upgrades. You can be looking at significant time for those to happen. We've gone through all sorts of things around dual connections to lots, crossing lot boundaries, and we've also had issues with consistencies of lot boundaries between different title offices. So that's also been a problem. So we can have land titles that have certain zones, and then you can look at local plans that have different boundaries. So there's been a whole lot that we've actually had to work through in that place as well. And as I said, you know, we've discovered that probably a large majority of our fast charger sites do require level 3 works to be undertaken, which adds, you know, significant cost to the build. But it's also actually just time. You know, then you obviously have Essential Energy or other grid authority approvals that need to apply, and that adds to the build cost as well. As I said, our build program, our experience with installing level 3 fast chargers is that, you know, you're looking at anywhere between, you know, kind of 4 to 12 months, depending on the site. I think 4 is our shortest one to date, and that would be a rarity as opposed to the common. And as I said, obviously you're looking at, you know, anywhere between 70 and about 120 grand per site, depending on the works that need to be done. And I said, I think it's just important that you obviously consider those when we're looking at where to put the infrastructure. As I said, a lot of sites that we've looked at have been ruled out just because of the cost to do the build upgrade works that would be required for that site to be viable. And as I said, I think it's just one of those things across the board. At the moment, it's going to be quite an expensive story until there's a bit more commonality and a bit more process around actually getting some of that power stuff back early. We've had a lot of, I'm going to move on to the charging experience. I said we've had quite a lot of feedback already from different people and EV drivers and enthusiasts about the idea of kind of uniformity of the charging experience. As the NRMA, we obviously want to make sure that every time someone turns up to an NRMA branded fast charger, they can be guaranteed the same experience. But it seems to me that that's actually something that people are wanting across the board. They don't want to necessarily have to figure it out. And I suppose the analogy is that, you know, a 3 to a 60-year-old can use a mobile phone pretty much these days because it's very common. The kind of process of using it is quite similar. And it's almost like the petrol Bowser conversation as well, which is they just want to turn up and go, okay, I've never used this particular station Bowser, but I know how to use it. So I think there is a conversation there around educating the public. And I do actually think it's a bit of a sleeping issue because I think there's a whole group of potential EV motorists at the moment that won't convert to being EV drivers, primarily because they don't understand the infrastructure and they're concerned about will they be able to use it. So I think that's something to really think about. And as I said, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there to kind of create that harmonious platform that people can actually go, okay, it doesn't matter which charger I'm turning up to, I'm okay. And just finally, I just want to talk about support operations. And I said, I think one of the key kind of takeouts from us is that, and again, this is kind of feedback that we had from site partners, both private and public, is that often infrastructure would be put in by a provider and then kind of left there and nobody would want to look after it. And even some councils that had put in their own fast charging infrastructure or were looking at doing it were concerned about, well, how do they look after it? What's the maintenance schedule look like for this? How do they support on-site operations if the charger's broken down? Do they want people calling, you know, the council office and talking to some customer service agent that doesn't know anything about the charger? So that piece is actually something that has been quite a complex piece for us. And as I said, we're really conscious of making sure that there is that kind of feedback loop, both for the site partners. So if the charger gets vandalised, we actually had one of ours vandalised last week, that they know that there's a process to support that charger to go back online and to be presented back to the community in the way that it was installed. But equally, if something goes wrong and the consumer, the EV motorist is there, and you know, what's your processes in place to support the motorist? And as I said, I think that's one thing that has been a great source of comfort to our site partners, is that we provide a full wraparound service for the infrastructure piece. So we're not just deploying it and saying thank you, goodbye. We're saying we're installing it, and if someone breaks down, we've got processes in place to help that person. We've got redundancy plans, we've got plan Bs in case they need to be towed. But we're also there to look after the actual piece of infrastructure and keep it maintained and operational, because again, we know that's a big gripe for site owners, but it's also equally a big gripe for EV motorists if they turn up and the infrastructure is not able to be used. And as I said, some of these things are things that are reasonably easy to fix. And again, we have a very good relationship with Tritium, who are going to be presenting next. So, you know, sometimes we've had error codes and things that can come up and they've been able to be fixed reasonably quickly. So far, we haven't had anything that's been a complete offline experience. But as I said, we've had a slight level of vandalism to the exterior of one of our chargers. But other than that, it's been reasonably good. And as I said, I think we're at the beginning of this journey. We've got 10 chargers now operational. We've still got another 30 to deploy under this program. And we're learning, as I said, more of this as we go. I would say the next 10 sites that we're working on, all are difficult for varying reasons. As I said, some of it's council process, and it's not intentional, but sometimes it can take a long time to get through to a council approval. Others are because we've got tricky power situations. We've got quite a few that have very unpredictable land titles, which we're discovering a whole lot of stuff in that space. So I think it's just to acknowledge that it is still very new. The actual process can be clunky, but that's okay, because I think, you know, everyone's learning as they're going. And I think as it becomes more streamlined, we're going to find that the actual deployment on site is a lot quicker. I would say now the thing that is the easiest for us is the build. These builds, they can take a couple of days and the infrastructure is ready to go. So it's actually leading up to that point is the bit that is probably the hardest part of the journey. But as I said, I'm very happy to take any questions after the next presenter, and I hope you found that helpful in the story as well.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I think everyone would agree that was incredibly valuable. So if people want to start putting questions in, we will go straight to James now, but then we'll come back to more.
Okay, great. Yep.
All right. So James, you're going to be sharing in a moment. So James is the Chief Technology Officer of Tritium. He's been in Tritium since the founding in 2001. And prior to that, he was part of Queensland's Sunshark solar vehicle experiment and even part of Deep Sea Challenger experiment, a submarine by James Cameron. So we're very lucky to have James here to talk to us, and I'll pass it over to him. Thank you, James.
Okay, can you see my screen?
We can.
Okay. Right. Well, mine is in some ways probably slightly less practical than Amelia's, given we don't actually install charging infrastructure. We sell charging infrastructure to people like Amelia who then install it. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about the charging infrastructure itself, given that's what we do. So to start with a little bit of background on Tritium, let me just see if I can make my computer work. There we go. So we're one of the larger manufacturers of DC fast charging worldwide, based in Brisbane, but we've got offices in LA and Amsterdam as well. Growing at quite a crazy rate in some ways, but this whole industry is slightly crazy, and that's something I wanted to talk about very briefly. Is it's unfortunate, something that I have to do when you give a presentation like this in Australia. Is that everything else I'll talk about later on, such as, what happens when we have 80% of the vehicles on the road are electric. You'll notice immediately audiences in Australia tuning you out. This guy's talking crazy talk. Whereas overseas, it's very much, in Europe and the US, it's very much that electric vehicles are a thing. Whereas here in Australia, they're still a weird thing for the hippies. So that I have a slide or two here at the start just to sort of get over that hurdle first. I mean, I'm sure for this presentation I'm kind of preaching to the choir, but it never hurts. So this slide here, actually I really should update this. This is 2 years old now, but as of last month, I think it was over 50% of new car sales in Norway were either electric or plug-in hybrid. And this is interesting. You can dismiss that a bit in that they have a rather large subsidy on electric vehicles, but the reason this is so interesting is that it shows what will happen in every other market when the price of electric vehicles naturally drops to price parity with the equivalent petrol car. And you look at the rate of the cost savings that are happening with batteries. They're sort of halving every 4 years. This price parity will occur. I mean, crystal ball gazing exactly when that's going to be, a bit hard to say, but it's going to happen. It's going to be within 5 or 10 years, probably closer to 5, I suspect. And at that point, the example that's happening in Norway right now shows that what will probably happen everywhere else. And the answer is every man and his dog goes and buys an EV. You get a real network effect happening there too. It's that when someone you work with, one of your family, one of your friends drives an EV, you take it for a drive, you're going to buy an EV for your next car. And whereas here in Australia, they're still so rare and so weird that most people, and Amelia made this point extremely well, most people are misinformed about the state of what the cars are like, what the infrastructure is like, and what it's like living on a day-to-day basis with an EV. Because the reality is, for most people, the base model EVs that are available now are a perfectly acceptable vehicle. You're heading up towards a 300 kilometer range on a lot of these base models. And that's really a game changer compared to what it was like a few years ago. The first generation Leaf with maybe 120k range. You have to be an enthusiast. You have to plan your trips. When you're up at 250 or 300k's, that has really kind of disappeared. So it's going to be extremely interesting to see what happens there. I can probably skip over this one. Pretty much know all that. So charging infrastructure. We heard Amelia talk about level 2 and level 3 chargers there. You can see them in the middle of the slide. Level 1, let's not talk about that. That's plugging your EV into a power point. Generally a bad idea. You have no idea of the condition of that power point. It hasn't got the safety circuitry, all that sort of thing. So Level 2 charger is a hardwired charge box on the wall. You get your electrician to put in for a couple $100. That's a pretty good option for charging at home. Level 3, that's what NRMA is rolling out. It's the right choice for what they're doing. But you are talking, you know, especially on the higher range vehicles. I mean, the high-end vehicles now, you're talking over 500 kilometers of range. That's a 2-hour charge time on a 50 kilowatt charger, which, it's starting to get a bit on the slow side. On the other hand, if you're out there for a trip and you've stopped in some country town for lunch and you want to wait for an hour or so, it's perfect. So from that point of view, at the time, you know, that they're rolling this network out, no question in my mind, NRMA are doing the right thing. The Supercharge, that's Tesla's proprietary one, that's a bit faster again. And then the very imaginatively named high power charging, that's the latest generation that's starting to be rolled out in Europe. So I want to talk a bit more about that, because that shows what you would expect to see in 5 or 10 years' time as a bit more of a common thing. And it really is a little bit of a game changer in a couple of different ways. A few years ago, high power charging, everyone knew it was going to be 120 to 150 kilowatts. And then almost overnight, the vehicle manufacturers said, well, look, this isn't fast enough. We need it to be better. And essentially pushed the limits up to 350 kilowatts. And part of that's done with a doubling of voltage in the battery pack. More is more current. How do you get more current through the same plug? So there's some fairly heroic engineering gone into some of this stuff with liquid cooled charge cables and things like this. But the 350 kilowatt number, it really isn't hype to say that it's a game changer. It suddenly means that while you're not down to petrol speeds, you're not far off it. You plug your car in, you go buy a cup of coffee, you come back and you've just added 350 or 400 kilometers of range to your vehicle. Long distance traveling is absolutely a thing with high power charging. And the other one, once again, Amelia alluded to this very briefly, is there's actually an entire demographic of people that can't really buy an electric vehicle at the moment. If you live in the inner city, typically you only have on-street parking. You can't exactly run an extension cord across the footpath. So at the moment, if you can't charge at home, you really kind of can't buy an EV. I mean, there's always exemptions, but in general, that's the case. Whereas high power charging allows you to stick with that petrol station mentality. Rather than plugging it in when I get home, like my mobile phone, I keep driving my EV like I drive my petrol car. I go somewhere once every week or two, I charge my car in 10 minutes and I'm back on the road. So it's a very different mentality, but on the other hand, it's the mentality most drivers have at the moment already with their petrol car. So what we'd see certainly is that once you buy an EV, you realize you don't need to charge it like this. 90% of the time you can charge it at home, and that's perfectly acceptable. But people aren't willing to buy the car in the first place without realizing that. And since they only really realize it once they've bought the car, you're in a bit of a catch-22. So having the availability of petrol-like facilities for EVs is a key thing in our mind. And certainly the 50 kilowatt charge network is acceptable from that point of view. People see these chargers out there. They realize that someone's spending money on this infrastructure. This must be a real thing. I should look at buying an EV for my next car. And it's vitally important. But the next level of that, again, is certainly the high power charging type stuff. So I think this one also pretty much mostly agreed with the previous presentation. Once again, I think this slide possibly is a little bit out of date. I really should update it. The answer on the percentages as to who's going to charge where, I think we would probably give you quite a different answer now than we would have 2 years ago, in that I now expect the high power charging to be a much higher percentage than we initially thought. But you're still probably only talking 20 or 25%. The bulk of the charging will still be at home, at work, at that slower rate. So as an example that this isn't something that's just pie in the sky, 10 years away, Ionity, it's a joint venture of essentially the entire German car industry, is busy rolling out a network in Europe right now. 400 sites across Europe, each one with somewhere between 4 and 6 high power charging heads. So they're running medium voltage connections in. I can just say to Amelia, if she thought life was difficult getting a 400 volt 3-phase connection, try talking to the utilities about getting an MV connection, you're talking 6 to 9 months usually before they'll even tell you if it's possible. So I know some of our other customers are also running into issues with this, and I also agree this is something where there's an obvious improvement to be made in the way that charging infrastructure providers interface with utilities and network operators. These guys aren't really thinking fast enough for the rate of change in this particular industry. So we see that across worldwide. It's certainly not just an Australian thing. People are looking to roll out large quantities of this infrastructure, and by far the largest time taken to do so is to get the network connection in place. Once again, yeah, these Ionity are now getting these sites in well under a week as far as actual time from groundbreaking to having something running. But it takes far, far longer than that to get the connection, even if the connection's there, just the connection approval in the first place. So certainly something to be improved there. So yeah, I think that's site 1 actually, I think. So yeah, that's our gear. You can see in this case, there's it's a bit of a bigger footprint than just the 50 kilowatt stuff. You've got that cabinet full of stuff in the background and the big pad mount transformer. But essentially this is a small substation. You've got 1.25 megawatts worth of charging capability at this particular site. And as you can see by the background there, it's already at a petrol station. So it's on truck stop type infrastructure on the highways. So once again, very, very different to the sort of network NRMA is rolling out, and I think extremely complementary to the network that they're rolling out. So it's certainly going to be interesting to see which way this goes in the future. And then I figured I'd just throw something in at the end. This one's a little bit science fiction, but usually gets people thinking. And the reality is it's probably only a year or two, 2 or 3 away. So EVs provide a huge amount of energy storage. I mean, the reality is when you buy an EV, you're buying a gigantic battery pack and it just happens to have wheels on it. So, you know, that 300 kilometer range I mentioned, that's real. That's a thing. You know, the base model vehicles right now are up around that range. That's the average Australian driving distance, 14,000 Ks a year. 10 million vehicles, that's 80% of the light vehicle fleet, and 200 watt hours per kilometre. That's a real world actual number. You know, you ignore all the marketing spin, that's what the average driver will probably get. So that's a 14% in electricity usage, which certainly makes the network operators excited. That's one way to sell more electrons, which is their job. But also the storage side, you're talking combined together, that's 5,000 times the capacity of the Tesla battery in South Australia. And you look at the impacts that that one facility has had on the electricity grid in South Australia, which are quite remarkable. You think of what capacity effects you could have with 5,000 times that capacity, it's kind of a big deal. Now, of course, if you used all that capacity, everyone's stuck and can't drive their car to work tomorrow, but I don't see it quite going that far. But it's more that this resource will be there at some point in the future. Now, is that 15 years away? Is it 20 years away? Is it 30 years away? I don't know. My crystal ball's a bit cloudy for Australia, but the reality is we will get to this point at some point in the future. And so, you know, these impacts that are happening here need to be thought about. And then the second side of that is energy transport. So if you can charge your car at a public charger, an NRMA style network, Ionity style high power network, you can take that energy home, you can run your house off it, you can sell some power back to your workplace to mitigate their peak demand in the summer. There's a host of options here that are all possible as soon as you start adding bidirectional charging into the mix. And that's not happening right now. It adds a little bit of extra, you know, wear on the battery pack. But all the vehicle OEMs are saying next model, i.e. 3 to 4 years away, the battery packs will have improved to the point where this bit of extra wear on the pack is a complete non-issue. So this certainly is on the way as well, and it opens up a host of interesting possibilities and interesting sort of trains of thought that when you start thinking about where this might end up. So I just wanted to finish on that note there, but yeah, I guess back to you, Daniel.
Great, thank you very much for that. I'll pass over to Alex now, who's going to corral these questions. And please, people, if you've got additional questions, I'm sure you do. We are a little short on time, but please keep putting them in there. We can always respond to them later or get the guys to respond to them. So Alex, do you want to jump in?
Sure, thanks, Dan. And thanks, Amelia and James, for presenting today. It's been really interesting. First few questions for the NRMA, and they're in regards to pricing. So Amelia, the first question we've got is, will the charges be free for corporate members? I think you're just on mute there. I'm going to unmute you one moment.
Okay. So we're working through that proposition piece at the moment. At the moment, it's free to any NRMA member, and that does include corporate members. But as I said, at the moment, we're still working through kind of the long-term proposition piece around the free to offer. And yeah, so at the moment, I would say at this stage, yes. And down the track, that might change, but at this stage, yes.
Great. And what's the pricing like for non-NRMA members?
So again, that piece is being worked through at the moment. As I said, at the moment, our infrastructure is free to anyone to use. The goal, though, is not necessarily make a profit return on it. So it would be like a supply charge. And that is, again, kind of in line with the fact that it's a social dividend investment. And as a mutual, we don't kind of make profits off things. We kind of reinvest whatever we do into our community programs. So the goal would be obviously to keep it very cost effective for that. And as I said, they're still trying to work through what that might look like as a long-term proposition. But I suspect we'll be in a position to do that within the next kind of 6 to 12 months.
Great. And then we had a question about the $70,000 to $100,000 site fee. Was that including acquisition charges and connections? What did that price include?
Yeah, so that's kind of the package, right, from kind of the site cultivation piece through to actually delivery of the actual infrastructure in place. So civil works, design, electrical design works, the actual charging infrastructure itself, the support model that wraps around it, and obviously too, there's a maintenance allowance within that for a period of time as well. So
great.
And some of those sites are becoming less expensive because we're getting better at figuring out how to deal with all the different layers of the charging story, whether it's from the site partner delays or energy provider delays. But I would say that, you know, still we have, most of our sites do require upgrade works, and that's where the cost is.
And will other Auto Club members be able to access the NRMA system?
So again, that piece is kind of currently being worked through at the moment. But obviously the goal is to have reciprocal arrangements.
Cool. And then we've got a question about how many chargers you'll actually have at each site.
Yeah, that's a good one. So look, we have a mix. A vast majority of our sites will be single charger sites, and we accept that there's a bit of a risk there because obviously if they're not working, we don't necessarily have a backup. But some of our sites, like where there's high volume, so our Newcastle sites are dual charger sites. So where there is when they're on kind of fairly significant roadways or towns, they're usually dual charger sites. And we obviously look at making sure that there is charging infrastructure in reasonably close proximity if for some reason our charger is not functional at that time.
And I suppose the other risk with having one charger and one parking space is, how do you ensure that the spaces are only used by EVs and not iced?
Yeah, so look, it's one of those things that we've really kind of tried to work through. So we have a few things in place. One is that we fairly heavily line mark the bay, which is for electric vehicle charging only. We also signpost the bay, both sides. But again, we don't, and we're basically saying to the local councils, which is most of our site partners, that their normal enforcement practices will apply. So it has, for use while charging. So if cars are not charging, whether EV or not, that they would do their normal enforcement policies. To date, we haven't really had any sites where there has been complaints, but look, appreciating James's, very apt presentation, we know this is going to be a problem as demand increases. And I think, as I said, there's that kind of long-term projection to think ahead to say, well, we may not necessarily put another charger at the same site, but there may be then demand to look at a second site within an existing town as well, so there is at least a backup site in close proximity.
Okay, great. I'm going to throw a few questions at James for a minute and give you a break. So I'll pop you on mute and then go.
Sure.
Okay, James, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. So we've got a question from Corolla at Everty. You showed a 12 kilowatt and 12 to 25 kilowatt charger for home or work. Do you know what the expected time frame to bring them to market is?
They're on our roadmap, but they're not something we're actively working on at a high speed. Like I said, the real demand there is probably for the next generation of EVs. So, you know, there's only so many hours in the day from my engineering team's point of view. So those products are a little bit further down the map. But I would say within, you know, 2 years, we should have something out there.
Great. And we've got Sonia at the Cities Power Partnership, and she's asking about the capacity for the Nissan Leaf 2.0 and bi-directional charging. Have you got any idea what systems they'll be using?
I think that's its onboard charger actually is capable of bi-directional charging, which is an interesting way to do it, though it does push up the cost of the vehicle a bit. Look, as far as I'm aware, that is capable of running for like a whole house UPS type thing. Nissan seem to be focusing it on disaster recovery. You know, you've lost your power and you can run your house off your car. So from that point of view, certainly useful, but I'm not sure it's capable of doing things like I mentioned, where you're using it to peak shave or energy arbitrage or some of the other more sophisticated sort of activities.
Okay, thank you for that. Do we have any more questions for James in the next minute or so, guys?
I can ask a question. It's Dan Hilson. I guess the question I've got is around fleet specifically. So are you seeing any use cases with your customers where if they've, say, got a big garage and they want to convert lots, you know, like the ACT government is a great example. You know, they're trying to migrate lots and lots of vehicles, and we were involved with that project. And have you seen any use cases where someone will put a fast charger in with a fleet as opposed to on street? Are there any use cases you're seeing emerging in that space?
Is that for me?
That's for you.
Yeah. Yeah, we have. We've got some fairly large projects running in Europe at the moment that are doing several hundred vehicle fleets. There's multiple ways to do this, but certainly one of the approaches we've seen is high power chargers actually, and they essentially have some guy that moves the vehicle around to the charger. So they keep the charger busy 24/7. They maximize the utilization of that asset and also keep essentially almost a constant power flow on the grid. So rather than having peaks where, you know, you've got 10 cars charging at once and then nothing later on, which will set you up for demand charges from the utility, which you don't want, they've actually found it's better off to pay some guy to basically move the cars around in sequence and keep them all topped up. Now, you start, once again, slightly science fiction, but it's probably not too far away where the cars will be able to do that part of it by themselves. So there's some interesting possibilities there.
Okay.
Obviously, the other way to do that is you just put in, you know, if you've got a fleet of 100, you put in 100 level 2 chargers as well, but that brings issues with turnover time and if the vehicle needs to go out again and things like that. So a few number of fast chargers where you cycle the cars through them seems to be a pretty good option.
And that would be typically for more logistics kind of company scenarios, the ones that you've looked at?
I know one of them is. I think another one's a taxi type application.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Might throw this one out to both of you. In the election lead up to EV policy development, have you been consulted or have you been having more detailed information sessions about charging network rollout?
Not much from our point of view. There's been a few people trying to get some controversial quotes, but I don't think there's been a huge amount of actual substance. I suspect NRMA might have done a better job than us on that topic.
Yeah, look, obviously the NRMA is wanting to be a bit of a thought leader in this space. And, you know, we know this transformation is happening and we want to be able to prepare our members for that kind of pending change. So as I said, we've been working across those political platforms to make sure people are aware of kind of what we feel is needed. But in saying that, as I said, I think you really couldn't have predicted what was going to happen with the Labor government announcement. And I think what it did really for us was just highlight, again, I suppose picking up on my earlier point, is just how far back on the journey the everyday motorist is on this. and how much we have to do just to get people comfortable with the idea that this is part of a story that is part of our future. It's not kind of an optional extra, and just how much work we still need to do to kind of make sure that people understand what we're talking about when we're talking about EVs, and then also the EV infrastructure story.
And we've just got a question about the state environmental plan amendment that you mentioned, Amelia. Is that a reference for follow-up, or is there a finalised version?
Yes, it's a final version, so I'm happy to send through the link to that. So it's a state environmental planning policy for infrastructure, and there was an amendment in December last year that specifically covered electric vehicle infrastructure. And I would say that was, quite a game changer for us in terms of just helping site partners be comfortable with the deployment of infrastructure. So yeah, I'm happy to send a link through following this meeting.
Great. And James, we've got a question about the kinetic or uncorded charging where the car drives over a pad.
Yes,
Is that? Yeah.
I'll go out on a limb here, but I'd say it's not going to happen. I mean, it's a cool idea, but the reality is, as the battery pack capacities keep going up, you really don't need to be charging on the fly like that. And also, just from a sheer cost impact, installing something like that in the road, especially if you're talking something that's tens or hundreds of kilometers long, just ends up being a completely crazy price. So, I mean, indicatively there, you look, highway works just to build a normal highway, you're talking millions of dollars to tens of millions of dollars per kilometre. You add EV charging on top of that, you'd probably double it again, if not more. Whereas for that kind of price, NRMA for a kilometre of highway build have rolled out a statewide charging network using conventional chargers. So I think it's kind of obvious from a cost point of view what the optimum way to do it is.
Okay, I think we've got one final question. This one is quite technical. From Gemini, will you try managed charging to support electricity networks during peak demand periods at the NRMA, Amelia? Is that something you can answer? Or should I chuck to Dan? I think you might have a bit of background on that.
You've got it muted.
Sorry, I didn't quite hear the question. My phone just cut out then, sorry.
That's okay. We've got a quite technical question from Gemini, right, and they're asking about managed charging to support electricity networks during peak demand periods.
I'm probably not the best person to answer that, but I probably can get John Cook to provide some feedback to the group following this meeting. So I know that he's looking into a whole lot of stuff in that space at the minute, and we've been asked to join a task force on that. So I'm sure I can get someone to give some advice back on that.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, I can probably comment a bit on that too.
Okay.
It's probably not really necessary with the extent of the network that NRMA has rolled out. I mean, 150 kilowatt charger here and there isn't going to melt the electricity grid down, but it is something that needs to be looked at for the future. When NRMA or somebody else has 40 or 50 chargers at each site, that might be a different story.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, James. Is there any thought being given to commercial vehicle charging? And anyone can take that question, I think.
Yeah, it's certainly a large percentage of our customers are doing exactly that sort of thing.
Yeah.
For NRMA's network, it's obviously targeted at the average punter, not a commercial user, I would have thought, but still.
Yeah, no, ours certainly is looking at kind of the everyday motorist at this point in time. But obviously, we have Thrifty Car Rentals as part of our brand as well. So we're looking at some things in that space. And, as I said, I think at the moment we're just focused on deploying the network to get the actual network happening. And really our focus is on trying to kind of educate the EV motorist for the future, really.
Cool. And in talking about your deployment, Amelia, have you confirmed all 40 site locations for your network?
Look, I would say that we know where we want to go. We've probably got a couple of sites that we're still locking down, but yes, we're pretty clear on where we're going. We probably will be in a position to release some level of network plan in terms of where that is, I'd say probably in the next kind of couple of months. But as you can appreciate, going through my presentation, we can often get to a point where we think we're very sure, and then we get a curveball, like a weird land title that suddenly means we can't move on that site, or we end up with a very complicated power story that may make it not viable. So at this stage, until we get to a point of being 100% sure we're going to build, we're not producing a full network plan, but we'll be very soon to be able to do that. So you will expect to see a fair bit of activity leading up to June. We have a lot of sites launching up to June, and you'll see some fairly nice progress on connected journeys. So watch this space. So some fairly key tourism routes will be fully connected by EV charging infrastructure very soon.
Great. And I think we'll take this as the final question for today. Amelia, this is for you. What is the utilisation like for the current chargers, and what percentage of time are they used?
So look, I would say that, you know, some of our chargers are in locations that are very heavily commuted to on weekends. So our site at Mittagong gets quite a lot of activity, for example. Hunter Valley Gardens equally gets quite a lot of activity. So we're seeing that it's quite very much dictated by weekend journeying at this point in time. Our Walls End charger seems to get fairly consistent usage by a very select few cars that obviously live near our charger in Newcastle, which is great. But I would say that the average charge time people are using, we've seen kind of around anywhere between 16 and 27 minutes. People are kind of coming through, which seems like a strange time. I think, I suppose our recent example, we just released our Bathurst charger, which received quite a lot of kind of co-media because Tesla are co-located with us. And that one in the first kind of month had about, I think it was about 30 sessions. So again, not huge, but still more than we probably expected for the Bathurst site, as an example.
Yeah, I can probably provide a little bit of info on some of our overseas networks there too. The heavily used chargers we're seeing on some of the Norway network, some of them are doing 30 or 40 charge sessions a day. At that point is where you are absolutely putting in a second or third or sixth or whatever charger at that site. But yeah, that's approaching, it's about 30% or 35%, I think, of time utilized. So, you know, they're doing 6 or 8 hours of actual charging per day. That counts as a heavily used charger.
Okay, well look, I just think it's about time to wrap up, but I wanted to thank you both, and I think everyone on the call would say we're very grateful for your time. Obviously NRMA is doing something extremely significant for the industry and for Australia in general, and you know, has to be congratulated. And Tritium, you know, is a fantastic Australian success story, and again, inspiring many in the local electric vehicle industry. So thank you both for your time. Just a couple of quick things before we go. One is a reminder to sign up to the program if you haven't already. We have some future webinars that are coming up, one with Woolworths and SEA, go through their experience of building a fit-for-purpose vehicle for the Australian market, which will be very interesting. Adelaide Council, Moreland Council, and Waverley Council will be doing a joint webinar on local charging infrastructure. The other thing is that Alex will just paste in a survey. The next step for our program in designing the platform we're building is for a number of workshops for co-design of that platform. And we'll be inviting people to attend those co-design workshops. And we'd really appreciate if you could. We're obviously putting a lot of effort in to provide some value, and we'd love if you could help us with a bit of that, bit of that co-design. And I guess just finally, finishing off on reminding us all while we're doing this, we've got lots of partners that have been fantastic: City Power Partnership, AFMA. There's too many to name. All the people that are contributing: Ausgrid, New South Wales Government, NRMA, and we're all doing this to create an urgency and accelerating towards low carbon transport. And we all understand how important and critical that is. So thank you all for attending and for your efforts. And I look forward to seeing you at the next one, which is on Thursday, the 6th of June at 3:30 to 4:30 p.m. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time.
Thanks, everyone.